Welcome back, everybody, to the chat with the mindful beekeepers. We are in Austin, Texas, so a lot of our stuff is based on Texas weather, but we also want to talk to you and answer your questions from all over the area. If you want to let us know what your specific area is, unless we know it already, that will help us determine how we answer your questions. But today we're going to talk about queen issues and what to do when we think there's a problem with our queens and what's causing potentially those concerns, and when we think that we might want to intervene or when it's not really necessary. Is that right, Les? I mean, I think that's what we're looking at. And welcome back, by the way, Les. I just know that you don't need any introductions, but I will do it anyway because we're live on YouTube at the same time. And you wrote that book, The Top Bar Beekeeping Organic Practices for Honeybee Health, and you're the king of top bar hives in natural beekeeping. You've been doing treatment-free beekeeping for over 30 years and keeping bees for over 55 years, I think I've counted, or definitely over 50 years. And you've done commercial beekeeping as well as backyard beekeeping, as well as sideliners, even pollination with top bar hives in your days. So with all that expertise, tell us all about those queens and what they're doing and when we should worry about it.
Well, I brought the subject up because we talk to people who have questions about their bees. And often right now in the Austin area, we're seeing the bees are contracting. So they're filling in brood with honey or just abandoning large sections of comb and raising a tiny little bit of brood. Because so it's hard to judge the queen's laying pattern, given that she's not laying very much anyway. Mm-hmm. And often people say, well, I think I need a new queen because she's not laying as much as she was laying on 10 combs. Now she's only laying on 3. Well, that's probably perfectly normal in Austin because they're reading the flowers, and today it was 109 degrees. It was very, very hot. And there's no flowers blooming because of the heat. And so the bees need to contract and get a small population to conserve their honey. And so this brings up 2 issues. It brings up people who don't have faith in their queen. And then it may bring up, make us able to see mites that are being forced out by the lack of brood and think, oh, we have a mite problem, when really it's just a perfectly natural kind of a beginning of a brood break. Mm-hmm. That isn't a mite problem. There's always mites, and they may form a bit of a problem, but it's actually a good thing to restrict brood to limit mite reproduction.
So before we go any further, I want to remind people there's a trend in queen spotting, and where even teachers, instructors initially tell their students, you have to find your queen to know that your colony is queen right. And that's not the case at all, by the way. You do more harm than good hunting for your queen every time you go in there. You're better off being able to read signs of the colony being queen right. And so very often we'll say either you've got eyes on the queen, you happen to come across the queen, or best, what you're looking for is eggs and or very young larvae. That's a sign that the queen was there either less than 3 days ago or less than 5, 6, 7 days ago. And at that point, based on the population and the resources and the demeanor of the colony, you should know that your queen is in there. But to your point, when there's a dearth, whether it's because of the heat or because of, no food, basically, that's what's causing the dearth, then at that point, you're going to have potentially queens that are either slowing down to a crawl or even potentially stopping laying altogether. And at that point, people that were relying on finding those eggs to decide if they were queen right or not will panic very often. So there's other signs potentially that can tell you that you've got a queen in there, or you can decide if it's the chances that she's just stopped laying is based on the outside, the environment, the circumstances of nectar dearth or the heat, right, Les?
Right. Quite often when you open a hive, the demeanor of the hive, if they're very nervous and start buzzing a lot and some going this way, some going that way, they may not have a queen. If they seem pretty calm and cluster around their brood and everything, even if there isn't much in the way of fresh eggs or anything, they may have a queen, but she's just not laying because really it's up to the bees. The bees clean spots for her to lay eggs. If they don't, she doesn't. And they decided that she shouldn't lay any eggs for a while to bring the colony population down. And if you have a colony that's still raising a lot of brood, it doesn't mean that your other colonies should be raising a lot of brood. Maybe they shouldn't be. Or, let them each one take their own strategy. Different colonies of bees are going to react to a dearth according to their genetic strategy and their background. And we'll see which one is right later on. But as long as there's food and they seem pretty calm and hanging together, I don't worry about trying to make sure every one of them has eggs right now. Later, once we get through the dearth, we should see a point at which they all start laying some eggs again. And then hopefully we get into September. It cools off considerably, but we always pray for this substance called rain. If it rains, we may get some flowers. Substance. And then we'll be hoping for a lot of brood again. Go back up for a summer bloom.
You're funny, Les. A substance called rain. We haven't seen that very much lately. That's the problem. But that
and I'm from New Mexico. I'm used to not seeing it.
Yes.
Although it got to be so rare in New Mexico that that's one of the reasons I'm from New Mexico. It's got to where it didn't rain.
So that's one reason you can have a broodless colony, which, like you mentioned, is not a bad thing. It can be a very cleansing cycle to let our colonies follow those contractions and broodless periods during the dearths, especially if it's the normal evolution of the colony and it's not caused by any problems. Because when you have no brood, then the mites cannot reproduce. So when we try to encourage our colonies to constantly be brooding up by feeding them supplemental feed, especially protein like pollen patties or pollen supplements, then that can cause a worsening of any mite problems you may have, because you give them more opportunities to reproduce. So keep that in mind and be thankful to see some brood break in your colonies naturally if everything else looks good, because it is a sign that the colony is going through a cleansing cycle. Now, what other reasons could there be that you don't see brood in the colony, and or what other problems may you see with a queen? So I will start first with the broodless. You could have a colony that's lost a queen or that's swarmed, right?
Right, and you don't know when you open your hive and look at it. Sometimes the behavior is pretty obvious that they don't have a queen. They're very nervous. They're prone, like I tend to work with bare hands, and they jump at my hands pretty quickly. They're very defensive. And that's also an indication that there's something wrong. Maybe there isn't a queen. Whereas if they hang calm and seem to be pretty tight in their little cluster, then that's a sign that they probably have a queen. You can just read that as behavior of the bees. But if the other thing is, if you're starting to see that they're raising drones in worker-sized cells, that's more than likely laying workers. And especially if it's scattered and you look closely and notice that there's multiple eggs in the cells, then you certainly have laying workers. That's a really tough one. I often wind up just combining them or shaking them out and giving their combs away and hoping I can make a divide later on. Because it's really hard to get them to accept a queen. You know, if you could come up with a queen cell, but at this time, the likelihood of coming up with natural queen cells is very, very low. But that's one way to get them to accept a queen. But if you buy a queen, they probably aren't going to accept her. So you just wasted $50 and you still didn't save the hive. And it's hard to get them to, you give them brood and they don't raise a queen. They kind of think they're their own, they are queens, it seems like.
And then at that point, they're trying to compete to pass down their genetics. So they're more defensive of any new queen that's going to come in, and they're not going to accept her very easily. Now, I find that if you have the opportunity and find a queen cell that's not capped yet, that they're still are able to rear, that's basically open with royal jelly, and they finish the rearing of that queen, I find that works pretty well. Is that your experience as well, Les?
That's the only thing that really does work dependably, or pretty dependably, but that's very difficult to find.
The timing.
When we're in the earth. And one thing that I've had happen was I found a hive with drone laying bees that were, you know, laying lots of eggs in the cells, and they're raising drones, and they raised a few queen cells. And I called somebody and he said, well, look in one of them and see what you see, if it gets mature, and see what you see. And these queen cells were extra big, if anything. They were almost like 2.5 inches long, really outlandishly long. And so I ripped apart one that was getting pretty mature, and there was a drone in it.
Right.
So they were trying to raise a queen out of one of their drone eggs, which is extremely dysfunctional. That's, you know, pretty autistic, so to speak, if we're going to call it that.
Right.
Are going nowhere at that point.
Right.
And so, but if you can come up with a ripe queen cell, a very ripe queen cell, they don't have to finish. That's the best shot you're going to have. But that's pretty unlikely. So I tend to just shake them out, give their combs away to other hives that can clean them out and use them. So, and then not give any place for wax moths or hive beetles to take over in their demise, and try to make divides later on.
Right, that's a good idea. So I've got a question, by the way. I want to remind everybody, if you have questions of your own, either pertaining to the subject for the day or what's going on in your apiaries at the time, just let us know. We'll be happy to help out however we can. Sherry's asking, how common is it to say queen on the last combs instead of where the brood is? We have one hive that has significantly less brood, and the last 2 times I've looked into the hive, she's been on the end combs.
She's free to go anywhere she wants. And apparently she doesn't have much to do in the brood nest right now, because they're not cleaning very many cells for her to lay eggs in. So she's free to wander around. I've taken the lid off and decided, I needed to come divide this hive. And I didn't look real carefully at the lid, because rarely ever is she on the lid. And I looked through the whole hive twice, couldn't find her, and realized, oh, look at all those bees on the lid. That's a lot bigger cluster than there was when I first set it over there. And sure enough, she was on the lid. And had I looked right at the beginning, I would have found her first thing that I opened the hive, but I didn't think to look. So she can be anywhere in the hive. And if when they're really laying lots of brood, she's pretty much stuck in the brood nest. There's her one chance to get out and walk around and look at the rest of the hive. She doesn't leave the hive and go outside that I'm aware of, but she does walk around, and you never know where you're going to find her. I've also found queens on the bottom of the hive, walking around on the bottom board or up on the sides of the hive. You just never know.
Well, and I find that sometimes if you use a little bit too much smoke, so there's a trade-off, right? You're trying to get them calmed down and distracted, but if you use a little bit too much, some of those queens are very sensitive to that, and they'll run and hide, depending on where you start opening the hive. Found them, under the inner cover in Langstroth, or in the all the way in the front of the hive, in the top of hive, hidden behind the honeycomb, the first one they usually have right by the entrance. And or she could be just wandering around and like you said, not having anywhere to lay. So she can be anywhere. I mean, some queens are more elusive than others, but like you said, they're free to go wherever they want to. And if
Right,
they're trying to hide, they will do that even more so.
right. And they do, the honeybee workers will encourage the queen to hide if they think there's big trouble. And so anytime you start a bee removal or whatever, you kind of want to quickly take open the space and stop movement back away from or into the next stud wall or whatever, because the honeybees will, the workers will quickly sequester the queen and try to get her out of the main part of the hive where all the trouble is and hide her somewhere. And then you won't get her, and they'll start their colony all over again if they can. So that's a good point. And as far as smoke goes, I try to use a minimum. And when I'm looking for the queen, I also have found that when I lift in the top of hive, if I lift a comb, I quickly look at the next comb over if I can, because often she's one ahead of me trying to get away from the light. And by looking at the comb I just lifted, gives her time to go to 2 or 3 combs down further in. Whereas if I lift that comb and quickly look at the comb I left in the hive, I quite often see her.
Mhm.
So, but you never know.
Right.
But certainly I want to say that business of queen spotting is just plain silly. You don't need to spot your queen.
Mm-mm.
You just need to see that there's good brood and leave her alone. That taking it apart that much would be totally destructive.
Well, I think that part of becoming a better beekeeper is to really learn to read the colony without having to find your queen.
Yeah.
Just kind of from the population, the behavior, the food, what you see with the brood, and the understanding of what's going on in the environment. Once you've got that, unless you're doing something specific or you're really doubting she's there, you really don't need to find your queen, and you just don't hunt for her going through every single frame or bar, through every single box on the Langstroth. That's super stressful to the colony. And what can happen if you are like us in a dearth, in the heat of the summer? First, this heat is super stressful. You're really disrupting their stasis, their balance of temperature and humidity levels. They're working so hard to keep in check. And it's going to cost them a lot of energy, meaning food and potentially lives, trying to bring that back down to that balanced level. And especially in smaller colonies, that's harder for them to keep that balance. So just keep that in mind. The other thing that you can trigger in a period of dearth like this, whether it's like before the nectar flow in the spring or in the summer heat, then you can trigger robbing, and robbing can get lethal to your colonies. And you really don't want to get into those hives for very long when you're in a dearth, and just kind of try to be in and out. If you don't have to go in there for any reason, I would say don't go in there much more than every couple, 3 weeks, and potentially even more if you knew that they had a queen and they were populous enough and had enough food. What's the reason to go in there much more often? You might want to check, if they've got still some food. You can lift up a Langstroth, you can look up the last combs at the end of a horizontal hive and make sure they still have food. And at that point, don't even look for your queen, I would say, right, Les?
Yeah, right now the bees are really struggling to keep cool. And our temptation is to overventilate, to open it wide open. We want to have a screen bottoms. We're thinking like a human that wants a cross breeze. But honeybees are trying to maintain the airflow. And if they have 105-degree air coming in, they've got to cool it a little bit. And the way they do that is they go out and get water drop it along the entrance, fan air against the combs full of water, and then as the water evaporates, it absorbs a little heat out of the air. So they're working with an evaporative cooler. And overventilation, they just overwhelms their brood. It's the brood nest that they have to keep the right temperature and humidity. And if we take it apart and expose it to that hot air, we're killing brood. And even if we overventilate in our thinking, oh, we'll help them stay cool, we're actually
when, as a matter of fact, we're batting down the hatches with our hives, we're making the entrances a lot smaller. They don't need all that much ventilation at this time of the year. They need to be able to maintain their homeostasis, their balance. So we just want to protect them more from robbing at this point. Hey, I want to say hi to the Bio Beekeeper on YouTube. It's nice to see you back. And I also want to say hi to Ashley in San Antonio. She's one young lady that just got started this year with a couple colonies. I think she's doing the conversions, by the way. And she seems to be doing great. She says her weak hive that she was concerned about actually did raise a new queen. So that was fantastic. She said that she added a frame of eggs from her strong colony to the queenless hive, and she went in Saturday and saw eggs. So congratulations, Ashley. And Les, can you kind of walk us through what happens if you think at this point, at any time, if you think that you actually are queenless, as an insurance? Ashley just kind of alluded to that.
Yeah, and a lot of people want to buy a queen, and that may be okay if you're sure you're queenless and aren't getting into drone land. If they're getting into drone land, it's too late. And if you're not sure if there's a queen in there, then you're buying a queen and they're not going to accept her anyway. So you have to try to be as sure as you can. And one thing you can do is, if you have another hive that has brood, I look for one that has some eggs. A little patch of eggs somewhere on the comb. Brush all the bees off, leave them in their original hive. Put the comb with eggs in the hive that you're worried about. And then that gives them a chance. If they don't have a queen, that's the only place they can raise a queen. They'll start raising a queen cell around some of those eggs. And and maybe they'll do a fine job and they'll raise a queen for you and she'll go out and mate. And for a month from when you put those eggs in, you may have some eggs that new queen is laying. And that would work out great. And so that was just an insurance policy. If they didn't need it, if they had a queen, well, it just gave them a little boost. You just gave them some comb and a little bit extra bees, and it didn't hurt anything much. I mean, it took a little out of the colony you took the brood from, but it wasn't that big of a deal. You never want to give a little tiny colony a whole bunch of brood because they just can't take care of it. It's kind of a waste of brood. So I try to find, if I can, the brood comb right near the edge of the brood combs that has, if possible, some eggs in it, and give that to boost the little colony that I'm worried about.
It's always better to give them just a little bit, especially if they're small, because like you said, you're not going to hurt much the donor colony. If they are really small, adding some capped brood with some open brood, but not too much, because they're going to have to rear that and feed them. And you don't want them to be weakened, but you're trying to bring that population up. So it kind of depends on what you're looking at. But yeah, and then what I like to do is, because I want to thank or just make up for what I've taken from that strong colony, I will give them, if I have it in that smaller colony, some unprotected worker comb. They will protect it. The queen will have space to lay some eggs again, and the impact will be almost null, because all she's got to do is fill those cells back in. They don't have to build the wax comb, and so that exchange is kind of like a balancing without impacting the donor colony too much. I do have some, and by the way, that's always my first intervention. I don't like buying queens. You never get them when you need them. It's always a hassle to get them into your colonies. It's just too much work when you have some brood from other colonies. And that's why it's nice to have several colonies in each yard where at least you have 3 or 4 minimum, then you can kind of share based on what the strong ones have for the little ones. And to your point, Les, if they had already a queen and we just couldn't find it or for any reason, then now they've got a just in case insurance policy that's going to bring them another week further down the road. You can check again in a week, see if they've got queen cells, or even if you come back in a couple weeks, and then you can give them some more of those eggs just in case, again, if you're still not sure that they're raising a queen or that there's a queen. It might actually also encourage the queen, if she's present but was not laying, to resume laying again if there's some nectar coming in at the same time. So and it will make up some of those low numbers. It will buy them some time, basically. It will prevent a drastic drop in population while they're waiting to rear a queen, right?
Right, and you may keep the colony that you would normally have lost because they went queenless alive until they can get a queen. We have a little colony that we saw in the class at your house that, you know, we could have let it go and it would be dead soon. It would have already died a few weeks ago, actually, and I gave it some brood, you know, a month ago or whatever that was. I can't remember, but then that was enough to tide them over. And then we got rid of their extra comb. They had some bee larvae and gave them a little bit more brood. And, you know, sometimes I've had those hives suddenly get to a point where they barely made it. And all of a sudden they got enough bees and they took off.
Well, there's a threshold, right? There's a point of no return where their size prevents them from growing, basically. They're just basically static. And if you push them over the threshold, then all of a sudden they're able to grow again. And that one colony had a queen, but it was super, super small. I swear there must have been like 200-300 bees that were in the box. Some of them were out foraging, of course, but there was a queen. So we kept kind of like nudging her along without overwhelming her and not giving her too much at a time. And I think that they're turning the corner from what we saw last time. So
yeah, the fact that they're still alive is a good sign.
It's a good queen too. I mean, she's pretty resilient, right? So Kristen's asking thoughts on adding space for ventilation. We have 2 single brood Langstroth, brood box Langstroth, both still working on building out comb. One's fanning outside the hive, but still have at least 3 frames with foundation only, no built comb. I wouldn't add any comb, and I'm assuming you're in Texas. If you're not, just let us know, Christine. But if they still have plenty of space at this point, unless you're in an explosive nectar flow with normal temperatures and there's no dearth, then I would just let them be for now, right?
Right, and the fact that they're clustering on the outside is perfectly normal when it's hot. It's just an indication they want their bodies out of the hive. And they can circulate a lot of air through a pretty small hole. And they might prefer it to be pretty small. And the extra space isn't going to help them unless they are in a big honey flow and they're really building comb. Then you could consider putting on a super or something like that. But I wouldn't give them any extra space due to the heat. The heat is a good reason to keep them fairly tight. And we can't think like humans. As humans, we don't want to be all hugging up next to each other when it's really, really hot. And we're all sweating, right? But we sweat. That's a different situation. Honeybees don't sweat. And they need to move air in an organized fashion through their own bodies and around their own bodies and to the brood. And we need to not make it harder on them by giving them extra space.
Right. And again, that also goes to keeping the entrances not too big, because it's like trying to climate control a building with the doors wide open. You just want to close them as much as possible. The bees in the front ventilating is usually actually a sign, not so much that they're hot, but that there's humidity that they're trying to get out of the hive. They're trying to ventilate, and usually dehydrate nectar is usually why they beard in the front, right, Les?
Right, and there may be a lot of humidity because they're bringing in water to cool the hive and then venting air past it. the air is already fairly humid here in the Austin area anyway. And so that's tough for them to humidify the air a little bit more to cool it, to get the water to evaporate out of the air, out of the water and cool the air. So yeah, too much ventilation is not good. Let them keep it small and really trust them to be great ventilation experts, because they are. They know how to ventilate their hive, and they really need to keep it fairly tight. And why even the screen bottoms, especially the screen bottoms, can way over ventilate them.
Yeah, I found that on the ones that I've seen before, I feel that it's done more damage than good. It's hard for them. And they go through a lot of energy, which, by the way, means less honey, both for themselves and for you. So just keep that in mind. I want to ask Doug to unmute himself so he can ask his question.
Thank you very much. So I have a question. I've been watching a show on PBS called Charlie Bee Company that somebody recommended to me. And one of the tricks I've seen him doing that I don't understand, and I was hoping you guys could explain to me, because unfortunately the show jumps around, so you don't totally get to understand the aftermath. But sometimes he goes to a tree in a neighborhood where bees have moved into the tree. And to get them out of the tree, he buys hardware cloth and he wraps it in a cone shape around their entrance so that when they exit, they can't find their way back into the entrance. And then he leaves a hive nearby. So he uses like a nuke or a Langstrom. And he says, I'll be back in 2 or 3 weeks and they'll be moved into that. And I think, oh, that's clever. But what I don't understand is, how does the queen end up getting moved in there? Is he just getting all the workers? Does that work? Because they never follow up on it. And I've not heard Les or read in his book any techniques like that for getting bees to abscond from something like a tree.
So that's called a trap out. Yeah, that's called a trap out.
I may have mentioned the trap out in my book. I don't remember. I've done them. I don't recommend them much. It can be somewhat of a help, but so the idea is that you have to make sure that the bees don't find another way back into the tree or whatever, or the fancy house is where we often do it, because they don't want to take the house apart, and so we have to trap the bees out of or they're afraid that if you mess with the roof, you're going to cause a roof leak. That's going to be a big issue, so you try to trap them out. And the idea is that you depopulate the hive inside. Usually I don't ever consider that I will get the queen. The queen will die inside with a few bees rather than come out. It might happen that she comes out, but it's very, very rare. Most of the time I've given them a coma brood on the hive that's outside that's catching the field bees. And you catch the vast majority of the bees the first few days. Then as the brood emerges, they go and become field bees very quickly because there are no field bees. And then they join your hive. But if they find any leak anywhere on that, particularly with the tree, it's an issue, because they'll be suddenly coming and going out the back of the tree where you didn't think they had any access. But they found a way around your trap. And so you give the colony that you're trapping them into, I hang it right there by where the old entrance, where they used to fly into the tree. And then I give them brood or a queen, but mostly I give them brood and let them raise a queen. And then you figure that the wax moths or hive beetles will destroy the comb inside the tree or in the house. And you have to make sure it gets sealed very well. If it's hive beetles, it's going to make a mess, potentially. Wax moths will make a fairly clean mess when they eat up all the comb. But you don't get the queen or all the resources out of the wall or the tree.
So basically, it's actually pretty cruel to do a trap out. It's very devastating to the colony, and very often you end up with no queen, and it's just kind of goes on for weeks, trying to get those bees into that box. That's the only exit they have to exit through. You're better off trying what is called a forced abscond, where it's a little bit of technical, but basically what you're going to do, you're going to drill holes into the tree below, understanding where potentially the nests might be, and you're just going to try to have holes underneath and above the entrance of the nest, where you're going to force some smoke. You can't really do it too fast either, because then you're going to have a bunch of sick bees that are going to die and potentially kill the colony. But with a little bit of finesse and technique, if you drill those holes so that you reach the cavity underneath and above, you can just kind of like slowly push them out. And at some point, you got to take breaks, push some smoke in, take a break, push some smoke in, take a break. More and more bees are going to start coming out. You can't do it too fast or you're going to overwhelm them. And then just little by little, they will give up at some point. You're still going to leave the brood in there and the food, but the queen will come out and you're going to get all the bees at once, as opposed to trying to, over weeks, trying to coax them into a box, and it's going to really deplete their resources and it's going to really deplete their numbers. All of a sudden you're getting most of the bees out and the queen. And then you kind of plug everything and you lose the food and the brood, but this way they cannot come back, or another colony cannot come back. If you do that in a structure, you really want to clean that comb from the brood and from the food, because that's going to rot out into your walls, and you don't want to do that in a structure, in the main structure, in a house in which people live. If you leave behind, so basically, whether you poison, do a trap out, or do a forced abscond in a man-made structure in which people live and the colony was in the walls, and you close it up, that comb is no longer going to be maintained at the right temperature. It's going to start melting. Critters are going to invade. Small hive beetles are going to infestate the brood, the pollen, the honey, and everything's going to start melting and growing maggots. You're going to have cockroaches, you're going to have potentially mice and rats, and it's just going to mold into your walls. It's going to be seeping through your walls. You just don't want to do that. So when you have bees in your walls, by the way, this is a good reminder to let your neighbors know about that, and so that they can call a specialist to remove those bees properly, not through a trap out and not to a forced abscond in this case, just for trees. Those. So Les, I've got other questions. Sherry is asking, I have one hive with 2 bars that are heavily cross-combed, and I'm assuming that's a topper hive, in the brood section, and I haven't seen the queen in a couple of months, but they have tons of brood. I considered separating the joint bar, but didn't want to damage the brood. Is leaving it alone the right thing to do? Absolutely, right? I mean, if they're making brood, you don't need to go through the brood's nest anyway, right, Les?
Yeah, you can eventually move it. Like in the spring, it might be empty. Particularly if you put it, excuse me, towards the edge of the brood nest. In the spring, they may move the brood away from it. Then you can take it out, straighten it out, or get rid of it and use it for beeswax or whatever is the most convenient. And so, yeah, don't tear it all apart now. Right now, we should almost always really be getting ready for winter. I know it seems early for that, but really we need to start letting them have the combs that they're going to have. Start thinking they're getting hunkered down for you got to get through this hot dearth that we're in right now. Maybe there'll be a bloom in the fall, maybe not. And then it's going to come to winter time. And it's time to leave them build up as much as they can. Store as much honey as they're going to need, and hope that they make it through these dearths. Yep. And don't tear them all apart.
Yeah, I mean, there's no need to tear it apart. The other thing that you can do is move those 2 bars when the weather cools off and activity starts over again. You can move it just at the edge of your brood nest. You move 2 of them at the same time if they're attached. There's no big deal, right? And you put it at the edge of the brood nest just before the honey. Then hopefully they'll backfill it with honey, and then you can harvest them right? Or you can push them to the front of the hive where you don't need to inspect them. But by pushing them to the back, eventually you move them out and you take out that old comb rather than living it in there forever because it's attached. So there's, just kind of think about what you're doing. No, there's no emergency to remove cross comb ever. And so you can always wait for when there's less heat and less weight of honey and less risk of rubbing and less stress on the bees. There's nothing wrong with leaving it in there, just cross-combed, right, Les?
Yeah. Even people, I know a lady in west of San Antonio that the bulk of her hive is completely cross-combed.
Mm-hmm.
So what I told her is, we could tear into it, we'd make a huge mess, we'd drown a bunch of bees in honey because they were full of honey. And she hadn't harvested the honey that we had taken off earlier. She hadn't taken it out of the comb. So wax moths were starting to move in, and I figured she didn't need the honey. So I said, let's put a straight comb at the back, and let's just say from here on, let's build straight on the top bars, and just leave all that. And then early in the spring, like February, March, tear it open and see how much of it's empty, and chop that off and get them into as little cross comb as you can. Or treat it when you start getting a honey flow like a bee removal. Just take it apart, put some comb on rescue bars, get rid of some comb, and treat it like a bee like you did a bee removal. Only it was easy because it was on the ground and you had top bars to take off instead of a wall to take apart. And then get them, concentrate on keeping them straight from now on.
Mm-hmm. So Niveen is asking, so a queenless colony will produce, by the way, Niveen is our apprentice, right? She's in our apprenticeship. She's in Houston, I think. I don't remember. Yes. But she's saying a queenless colony will produce a new queen from eggs you introduce, even though it has laying workers. If it's got laying workers, it's actually not really necessarily the case because at that point they're competing and they might destroy those eggs anyway, right, Les?
Right, if you give them eggs, so they kind of descend into laying workers. If they have a queen, the queen inhibits the workers from laying. If they get queenless, they start trying to raise a queen from a one-day-old larvae. And that, in a sense, gives them a sense of having a queen because they have the queen larvae giving off a little bit of queen smell, not normal queen smell, but something that gives them hope. If for whatever reason, let's say that they get a queen, they raise her, she emerges, she goes out and mates and she gets caught by a flycatcher, she never comes back to the hive. Now they're hopelessly queenless. They don't have any eggs the right age to raise a new queen. If you give them eggs, okay, we'll try again. And they do. Now, if they stay queenless long enough, then the workers start getting their ovaries developed and they start laying. And then they kind of take on queenly airs, we could say. You get to thinking, well, we make pretty decent queens. And maybe we'll just be the queens. And they won't raise a queen, they won't accept a queen. You give them brood and they just raise it as workers. You give them a queen, they kill her. And so it becomes pretty hopeless. And so once you get to and the main way to tell with laying workers is you start getting a lot of drones in worker-sized cells. And if you look in any cells, particularly if there's drone cells around, and you see multiple eggs, and a queen can reach down to the very bottom of a cell and lay an egg bottom center of that cell. The worker can't reach very far and just kind of sticks her abdomen down in there and lays eggs higgledy-piggledy around there. And so it's all jumbled up looking. That's a sure sign you got laying workers. And what I do is I shake them out, give their combs away, and try to make a divide later on. That's a lost cause.
Yep. So the other thing that you can have a pattern of brood where you have worker cells with some drones poking out of the too small cells for them. But a laying worker colony is not the only reason that you can see that. Is that right, Les? What's the
There
other
can be
thing?
some intermittent drone cells amongst worker-sized cells. If you have workers being developed, you have a fertile queen, because workers are females and they have to have a mom and a dad. So if there are any workers actually being developed, then you do have a fertile queen. If there's drones and workers, you could have a not very fertile queen, a queen that's having trouble with her fertilizing her eggs. And there is such a thing as a drone laying queen, perfectly good looking queen, but for whatever reason she didn't mate, or she didn't mate properly or something, and she's laying drone eggs everywhere she lays eggs. And that happens on occasion. It's fairly rare. I've seen it a few times in my life.
Right.
And that queen needs to go. You need to get her
Quickly.
replaced by a new queen that is fertile.
Yeah, that one would spell the doom of the colony. But mostly you have laying workers that cause this. A queen that was never mated, that's completely infertile, in which case you will see those only drones, basically. But it can also happen to a certain extent, and that happens quite a bit with poorly mated queens. They will lay most of their eggs as workers. They will be able to fertilize most of the eggs that they lay in worker cells, but sometimes they'll miss and they'll shoot blanks. And so those are worker drone male non-fertilized eggs that she's laying in what she thought was going to be workers. And then to a certain extent, that can get really bad if she's very poorly mated. And the other aspect of that is if she was poorly mated and starts running out of steam, that can get worse and worse and worse. To the point where when she ages out also, even if she was well mated, she might end up running out of sperm and start laying more and more drones to the point where she can't lay workers anymore. So there's a spectrum of things that can happen here that can cause those issues. The other thing that can happen with a brood pattern, we all like looking at brood patterns and seeing those big tight slabs of capped brood that indicate strength and health very often, but then sometimes it's spotty. Les, what are your thoughts on spotty brood, issues with the queens? What's going on here? What are the multiple reasons why that can happen?
Well, there's a whole lot of reasons. Inbreeding is one. So and this is an issue with commercial breeders even, because they wind up with drone mother colonies. All their queens come from the same mom. And if the drones start mating with their sister, they get inbred, and then the honeybees have what they call sex alleles. There's last I heard there was about 24 of them recognized in the bee genome, and if they get repeated from their mother and their father, it makes an unviable larvae. The larvae aborts itself, so to speak. So that means that the queen lays eggs everywhere, but a certain percentage don't work out. So that leaves a hole there that gets an egg laid later, but now it's out of phase. It's younger than the older larvae that the queen laid before. That starts a brood nest pattern that's a mess. And the reason that the brood pattern is nice to keep tight is because worker bees, as they age, require different types of royal jelly and or food. And if a nurse bee is feeding a bunch of bees that are all larvae that are all next to each other and about the same age, she's got what they need. She can make what they need and go from one to the other pretty quickly. If she has to find, oh, there's another worker way over there that's that age, and then there's this really old worker right here that I don't have appropriate food for, she has to hunt for workers the age she's ready to feed. That totally disrupts the brood nest. So it's nice to have a fairly tight pattern, even if it's small.
Mhm.
And so, and a loose pattern is often the beginning of the demise of a colony. If it gets really loose, the brood doesn't emerge very well. You start getting to where you have depopulation, the colony quits growing, quits thriving. And I would take a very loose laying pattern as a sign that we may need to requeen that hive or to get them to requeen themselves if they don't supersede.
Mhm. And keep in mind that's also dependent on what's going on around and the degree of disorganization that you see, right? That could be linked to some backfilling of the brood's nest or food nutritional issues, not necessarily always to the quality of the queen. But to Les's point, what's interesting is that in a really optimal configuration, the queen will lay in a concentric pattern. And so those nurse bees will be able to follow that line further and further out and then come back and do it again once they emerge. If they are scattered everywhere, then the bees will go here, there, and everywhere, and it's highly inefficient. So to Les's point, you really, I mean, we really like to see those very tight brood patterns. The other thing that
However, right now, when the brood is collapsing, don't judge the queen on her spotty pattern, because it may just be because they're not getting cells ready for her, because they're trying to reduce the population in this hot dearth that we're in here in Texas, at least, or anywhere where there's a dearth and they're depopulating the hive. Don't judge the queen, give her a few weeks and then see if some bees are laying well and others aren't, then judge her.
Just the same way you're not going to judge the queen based on the population or the variation of populations at this time of the year in a dearth. But by the way, in a dearth, let's talk about there's a question from it's going up, Christine. Okay, we don't have so when we don't have entrance reducers right now on our colonies, and it's a dearth, it's hot. We've been doing that. We've been putting up either the disc entrance reducers or the bar entrance reducers on the Langstroth. We're batting down the hatches because what happens with that contraction of population and the decrease in nectar flow, you got idle foragers that are looking for food. And if they cannot find it in nature, in the environment, they're going to start looking anywhere they can, including in their neighboring colonies. So if the doors are wide open, basically, it's easier for them to break the defenses of the colony and just kind of slide one or two bees to go check out what's in the pantry and then come back and get back in full force with a lot of their peers, especially if it's a large colony, and just rob out potentially to death your colony. So that's another reason to really install at this time of the year, especially in Central Texas, where we're in a pretty bad dearth right now in most areas, not all of them, but most of them, and just put those entrance reducers down to the minimum. You want, just enough for traffic. So if it means one or two bees, a little pinky finger, that's fine. That's what you want to do. Don't leave the doors wide open. You're taking a huge risk of your colonies being robbed out, and we've seen it happen. Becky's asking, do queens only have one chance to mate? They can't go out and mate again. So one is a little fast. They can go one time period in their life, but it could take 1, 2, 3 days, right, Les? They could be back to back.
Right. And there is a period when she first emerges from the cocoon. She doesn't go out and mate right away. She hangs out and eats and sort of finishes off her development out of the cocoon. Mm-hmm. And then she gets in a fertile state where she's ready to mate. And that might last for a week or two if she's delayed. Like if there's bad weather and she can't get out to mate, or maybe she mates one day but then didn't get enough semen to really fill the spermatheca. She may wait for better weather and then get out again later. I don't know how they do in these really hot days, They may try to get out real early in the morning, but then if you keep her in the hive past that fertile period, she becomes infertile again. Then she's not going to go out and mate ever. And then she'll just be a drone laying queen.
Mhm.
So her body kind of knows when she's filled with spermatheca. She may mate with 10 to 15 drones, whether that's all in one flight or whether it's usually in a couple of flights where she makes a couple of different days, she goes out and mates, then returns, and then she never mates again the rest of her life. She's got all the semen that she'll carry for the rest of her life. And, but it has to happen during the week and a half or 10 days that she's fertile.
Mhm. Just she'll stop mating day to day when she's got enough stored up in her spermatheca, basically. But after that, she's done. Kathy is asking, someone recommended that I use a wet sheet to help my colonies fend off robbing until dusk. Well, with this heat, the sheet dries fairly quickly. So does that mean I have to keep wetting it? And by the way, that's only in an emergency situation, when you've got robbing on its way and you're trying to stop it. The bees will try to get in everywhere, and the robbers tend to fly straight into the entrance as opposed to trying to walk in there. So there's a couple of things going on. You've got robber bees trying to get in from everywhere, cracks and crevices, and there's a frenzy, and bees are fighting, and then you know that you've got potentially a serious issue, and you want to really stop it in its tracks. Then you use that wet sheet, you throw it over your hive and let the bees that are house bees wait it out. The robber bees will eventually give up. The bees that live there, foragers that live there, will wait it out and see if they can get in either tonight or tomorrow. So that kind of distracts them, but it's just a temporary solution. And usually at night, the robber bees will leave and probably not come back in the morning, so you can remove it. The other thing I would say is that if you've got a robbing, you can install robber screens. So you can makeshift some very simple ones. You know those packages that come with a 1/8 of a screen that you can cut in basically in bands, and then you can make tunnels, just a horizontal tunnel over your entrances, whether it's a Langstroth or a top bar hive. You just make the bees that live in the hive get in and out from the sides, and the robber bees that are trying to fly straight into your hive will bump into the mesh and not be able to find the entrances that are not on the side. It'll be a little confusing for your colony, but it'll definitely be better than just having them fall prey to the robbing. Les, what's your thoughts on the sheets?
It's a fine emergency. Like if you go in there fighting at the entrance and chaos, lots of bees trying to get in, you can always tell a robber, because the bee that belongs there flies pretty much straight in. Bee that doesn't belong there bounces and jumps around and tries to wait for everybody to look the other way and then get in the back. Look underneath the hive and around the back of the hive in case there's a hole somewhere else. So that's a robber. It's the same as humans, we recognize when humans aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And so the wet sheet will stop that robbing in process right at that moment. If you left it on indefinitely, the robbers would figure their way around the wet sheet, and it would also disrupt the hive quite a bit from its business. So it's just a temporary thing until you can get all the entrances, any little holes. If it's the Langstroth hive, are there any corners that are broken or splitting apart where the bees are coming and going somewhere else? If, fill it with some mortar or mud or whatever it takes to seal that, all the extra holes, and then shut the main entrance down to one small hole. And the rubber screens work because the robbers want to fly in the door past the guards and just bypass security. If they have to land and walk right through security, they won't try it. So the screen is there to just break the flow and make it impossible for the robbers to fly straight in the door and make them walk in, make the will make them have to walk in, and the bees that belong there will. The bees that don't belong there won't. They can't, because the security's sitting there watching them as they come in.
And you leave those until the nectar flow resumes. You don't leave those forever. You just kind of remove them to facilitate the flow, the traffic. Once the nectar flow resumes, then you'll have a lot more bees going in and out from the hive, and they'll be also better able to guard. But most of all, every bee will be trying to find food in the environment, and there'll be a plenty, so they're not going to be caring about your hives. The other thing I would say, in a dearth at this time of the year, if you're in Central Texas especially, but any summer dearth, and you have to provide some kind of emergency feeding. We don't really do that. We prefer to equalize and give some extra, a surplus of honey or nectar from one hive to the other. But sometimes you have to provide some emergency sugar syrup, no pollen supplements for many reasons we will not get into today, but we can talk about it at another time. You just don't want to spill anything. You don't want it to spill on the floor of the hive. You don't want to spill out the entrance. Don't want that open up in the air, because bees are like sharks, and blood in the water is the sugar or the honey or the nectar. So you just want to make sure that you're very quick and clean about how you do this. It will trigger otherwise a robbing incident very quickly.
Right.
With this being said, I wanted to say hi to Becky, Kathy. We are seeing some people coming back. Denise, and Dennis, and Dwayne is in our apprenticeship as well. Christine, thank you for your question. Lolly is in our apprenticeship. That's cool. Naveen, and our friend Richard, Sarita, and Larry, Sherry, and Sherry, both of them. So it's really nice to see you guys, and thank you for your questions. Think about the things that you see in your hives for next week. We'll be back at 7:30 Central US time. Barring any major holidays, we'll do that every Monday. And while you think about your questions, just have a fantastic week. Stay cool, and thank you for your time and conversation here. Les, thank you so much. Above all, for your expertise and your knowledge, and taking the time to answer questions every week for the benefit of our followers. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for everything and your answers too. And let's all see each other next week. Bye-bye.
Sounds good.